She moved through Seattle General's ICU in Atlanta like smoke moving through a room, present but unnoticed, necessary but invisible. That was the skill. That was the training. Captain Sarah Chen had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being overlooked, of blending into hostile territory wearing Navy scrubs instead of body armor, her presence so unremarkable that doctors walked past her twice without registering her face. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and the particular cold that comes from industrial air conditioning running 18 hours a day. Fluorescent lights hummed their perpetual mechanical song above rows of beds occupied by the kind of patients who barely registered as human anymore, broken bodies sustained by machines, their breath synchronized to ventilators, their heartbeats outsourced to monitors that beeped with metronomic precision. She moved between them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done far worse in far darker places. Room 347 was on the east wing, third bed from the corner. The man in the bed had no name on her assignment sheet, just a patient ID and a single word in the psychiatric notes, paralyzed. But she knew his name. Everyone in her unit had known his name. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 tours in Kandahar, 2 silver stars, a jaw that could cut glass, and hands that used to shake the way fighter pilots' hands shake when they've had too much coffee and not enough sleep. Those hands didn't move anymore. The assignment notification had come through her secure email at 05 for 7 hours. Not unusual. Not remarkable. Just another nurse, another rotation, another paralyzed Special Forces officer recovering from a spinal cord injury sustained during what the official reports called a training accident in Fallujah, but what she knew meant an ambush that went sideways. The difference was that Marcus Webb had been the commanding officer. The difference was that he had sent her son into that particular firefight, the one that never sent him back. She checked his pupils first. Left, then right. The penlight caught in his eye with that cold glass reflection, and she noted the asymmetry, subtle, the kind of thing most nurses would miss, the kind of thing that mattered if you understood what you were looking at. She wrote it in his chart with the kind of clinical precision that made documentation stand out. Pupil reactivity decreased on left side, she wrote. Recommend neurology consult for baseline assessment. The folded flag sat in her locker downstairs, tucked behind her spare shoes and the water bottle she never drank from. She had pressed her hand against it for exactly 7 seconds when she arrived at 0530, the way some people touched crucifixes or prayer beads. The flag smelled like the funeral home and her mother's perfume and 37 years of promises nobody kept. Her son's name was carved inside her left wrist, a thin scar shaped like letters that only she could read. Daniel Chen. 19 years old. Last words, Mom, I'm heading out on patrol with Colonel Webb's unit. See you at dinner. Dinner never happened. The Pentagon had called her directly, using a number she hadn't given anyone. A woman's voice, professional and precise, had explained that they needed someone embedded in the hospital. Someone who could observe. Someone who could document. Someone who wouldn't be recognized. Sarah had listened to the rest of the briefing without interrupting. They were investigating Dr. Raymond Mercer, the head of trauma surgery at Seattle General, Atlanta facility. 18 months of questionable mortality outcomes. 15 wounded veterans who had arrived stable and left as statistics. The official story was that their injuries were incompatible with survival, but the Pentagon had begun to wonder if someone was stacking the deck. They wondered if Dr. Mercer was letting certain patients deteriorate. They wondered if research data could be inflated through strategic intervention. They wondered if a man with enough institutional power could turn a hospital into a place where the wrong people died quietly. We need an observer, the voice had said. Someone who understands the military. Someone with medical training. Someone who can be invisible. Sarah had thought about her son. About whether he had been let down by someone in a position of authority. About whether there was any difference between being killed on patrol and being killed in a hospital bed under the care of someone who didn't care whether you lived or died. When do I start? She had asked. Now, watching Colonel Webb's oxygen saturation climb back to normal range as she adjusted his position, she understood that this wasn't about justice. It was about whether there were still people in the world who gave a damn when they were supposed to. Whether anyone still did the right thing when no one was watching. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway at 0603 hours with the kind of silent precision that suggested he'd been standing there longer than she would have liked. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a shine that cost money, real money, the kind that required years of successful medical practice or family money, or the kind of leverage that came from knowing things about people. His scrubs were tailored. His hair was grey and distinguished. He looked like the kind of doctor who appeared in television commercials, the kind who made decisions about life and death with the casual certainty of someone who had never been told no. He watched her chart with the calculating gaze of a predator identifying prey, his jaw tightening as she completed a neuro exam that she had learned in a trauma bay in Baghdad, where real doctors were 12 kilometers away and you did what needed doing with what you had available. She noted the position of his shadow across her documentation, the way he stepped closer without actually entering the room, the way his fingers drummed once against the doorframe, a micro-expression of irritation. "Detailed assessment," he said. "Not a question. An observation." "Standard neuro protocol," she answered. Her voice came out soft, deferential, the voice she had built for this job. The voice of someone who knew her place in the hierarchy of hospital authority. He studied her for 4 seconds. She counted them the way she had learned to count time in gunfire. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. 3. 4. "See that you don't overreach," he said finally. "The residents handle the interpretation of neuro findings. You document. That's your scope." She nodded. She didn't flinch. She didn't correct him about the obvious asymmetry that any competent neurologist would catch within seconds. She accepted the boundary he was drawing with the same steady hands that had held soldiers' guts inside their abdomens with nothing but gauze and prayer while a mortar team was repositioning 3 blocks away. He left the room. She finished her assessment. She touched the flag through her scrub pocket, just her fingers against the fabric, lasting 2 seconds, and then she wrote her notes with the kind of precision that would mean something when the investigation finally landed. The morning shift change happened at 0700 hours. Sarah moved through the unit with the kind of invisibility that was either a gift or a curse, depending on whether you needed help. She checked 6 other patients, documented their vitals, noted the ones whose treatment seemed questionable and the ones whose care was exactly right. She was 3 steps into the observation charting when she realized Dr. Mercer was watching her from across the ICU, his arms folded, his expression the way a chess player looks at an opponent who has just moved a piece he didn't expect. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't let him see her understanding. She simply continued her work with hands that had held lives together in conditions far worse than a climate-controlled American ICU, hands that had learned long ago that composure was a weapon and visibility was a liability. The ticking clock had already started. She could feel it. 2 days. The Pentagon had said he would call in 2 days if the initial observation seemed significant. 72 hours to document enough evidence to move forward. 72 hours to prove whether Dr. Mercer was simply incompetent or something worse. She touched the flag one more time before she left for her break, pressing her palm flat against the fabric the way some people pressed their hands against a wall before walking into battle. The folded triangle of navy blue was surprisingly heavy for something that weighed almost nothing. Her son's final weight, her mother had said during the funeral. Reduced to a flag and a casing of spent ammunition. Sarah Chen had chosen to become invisible so she could see what others missed. She had chosen to work nights so she could observe in darkness. She had chosen to come here, to this hospital, to this man, because someone had to care whether the wounded lived or died, and if nobody else was going to do it, she would do it alone. The colonel's eyes were closed, but his monitor showed him tracking her movement across the room. Somewhere in that paralyzed body, somewhere behind the spinal cord damage and the medical reports, Marcus Webb was still conscious. Still aware. Still waiting for someone to notice whether he lived. She was going to notice. She was going to document. She was going to make sure Dr. Mercer understood that invisibility was not the same as powerlessness. 2 days until the Pentagon called. 2 days until everything changed. During morning grand rounds, the conference room at Seattle General fills with the smell of stale coffee and the particular exhaustion that comes from 12 residents and for attending physicians crowded too close together before sunrise. Dr. Mercer pulls Sarah's nursing notes onto the projector screen, and the fluorescent lights cast his shadow across the whiteboard like a sundial measuring her humiliation in real time. This, he announces, his voice dripping with theatrical contempt, is what happens when support staff watch too much television. He reads her observation about the colonel's pupil reactivity in a mocking sing-song voice that turns the clinical detail into a punchline. Our friend Nurse Nightingale here thinks she's discovered something 3 board-certified neurologists missed. 3 residents smirk into their coffee cups. One bites the inside of his cheek to hide the smile. The attending physicians suddenly become very interested in their shoes. Sarah stands at the back of the room with her tablet held at chest height, her posture a study in professional neutrality. Her jaw clenches once, barely perceptible, the kind of twitch only someone trained in restraint would recognize as anything at all. Her hands don't shake. Her voice doesn't crack. She watches Mercer like she's cataloging targets for a raid she'll never be ordered to execute. "Tell me, Ms. Chen," Mercer continues, his eyes finding her in the back row with the precision of a hunter who spotted movement in tall grass, "did you complete your neurosurgery fellowship at County General, or was it perhaps Seattle Community College?" Laughter ripples through the room like dominoes falling in a pattern Mercer has engineered 1,000 times before. He's competent at this, which makes it worse. He's not bullying from insecurity, he's bullying from absolute certainty that the hierarchy is immutable and that his position at the top of it is geological, permanent as bedrock. Sarah meets his eyes with the flat calm of someone who has been in rooms where actual weapons were present, where actual stakes existed beyond academic territory. Her face is a mask with nothing behind it. She says nothing. That would be the move of someone who could be broken. The nothing she offers instead, that's the move of someone who simply doesn't register him as important enough to require a response. Mercer's smile tightens around the edges. He expected either tears or anger. The absolute absence of either bothers him in a way he doesn't quite understand. The silence stretches for 3 seconds. 4. 5. Then one of the residents clears his throat and Mercer moves on to the next patient, but something has shifted in the room, a barely perceptible rebalancing of weight that nobody can quite name. After grand rounds, Sarah charts in the ICU with the methodical precision of someone who learned documentation in combat zones where every detail might someday need to be presented as evidence. That afternoon at the 3rd-floor vending machine, she approaches Dr. Rashid and Dr. Kim, 2 physicians she's worked beside for 8 months through night shifts and code blues and 3 a.m. conversations about whether they'd made the right choice going into medicine. Mid-sentence, Rashid stops talking about the colonel's declining status. "Oh, I'm getting paged," he says, though his phone hasn't buzzed. Kim nods frantically. "Same. I need to check the lab results on my patient." They walk away while Sarah's words hang in the air like a question nobody wants to answer. Her hand is still extended, still holding the bag of peanuts she was about to offer to share. She doesn't pull it back immediately. That would show they'd hurt her. She lets it sit there for a long moment before lowering it slowly, a small ceremony of watching people she trusted make their calculations and choose survival over solidarity. By the nurse's station, she overhears Mercer telling the charge nurse with the casual confidence of someone whose words carry institutional weight, Chen seems to think her 2-year degree makes her qualified to override physician judgment. Perhaps she needs remedial education on scope of practice. The charge nurse, who has worked at Seattle General for 17 years and knows which way the wind blows, nods as if Mercer has just stated a fact as indisputable as gravity. Sarah pretends to be absorbed in the medication dispensing system. Her fingers move across the keyboard with mechanical precision. Her face remains composed, but inside her chest something shifts, a door closing. A calculation being made. The calculation is simple, she's alone here. Her cover is holding because nobody knows who she really is, and the moment they know, the pretense becomes irrelevant. But right now, the pretense is exactly what's keeping her embedded, and Mercer is trying to use her professional isolation as a weapon. He doesn't understand that isolation is what she was trained for. Isolation is what Special Forces operators live in by definition. Being unsupported is her baseline, not her breaking point. That evening during shift change, Mercer corners her outside the supply room, speaking in the quiet tone of absolute authority that men with institutional power reserve for moments when they want to ensure compliance without witnesses. There are no residents around. No attending physicians. Just the two of them in the hallway where the sound of the ventilator in nearby room 341 creates white noise thick enough to muffle conversation. Your detailed assessments are creating documentation problems, Ms. Chen. His voice is calm, which makes it more threatening than any shout could be. They imply our physicians are missing things. That our protocols might be inadequate. Continue this pattern and security will escort you out permanently. Do you understand? Sarah's hands stay steady at her sides. She doesn't cross her arms defensively. Her breathing remains even. Her eyes meet his with level calm that seems to come from somewhere below consciousness, from a place where fear has been trained out and replaced with data. Her voice is flat as a scanner's monotone, "Understood, Doctor." She shows zero reaction to his threat. No widening of eyes. No quick intake of breath. Just acceptance of information, like he's told her the cafeteria is serving meatloaf for lunch. Mercer expects fear. What he gets instead is a kind of professional compliance that feels like being ignored, which might be worse. He walks away, his footsteps echoing on the tile, his sense of dominance subtly undermined by the fact that she didn't beg or promise to change or ask for another chance. She simply accepted his terms like someone who had already accepted far worse. But later, alone in the supply closet at 22:16 hours, Sarah presses her fingers against the folded flag in her locker, the one they handed her 3 years ago instead of her son, the one she brings to every assignment as her reminder of why the work matters. The fabric is cotton and loss combined. It's soft in a way that hurts. She allows herself exactly 30 seconds to remember why infiltrating this hospital matters, why she's willing to absorb public humiliation and social isolation and the particular sting of watching people she helped turn their backs. Her son died because someone wasn't paying attention. Because someone prioritized institutional politics over patient safety. Because someone looked at irregular vital signs and decided convenience mattered more than intervention. She won't watch it happen again. Not while she's breathing. Not while her eyes still function. Not while she has access and clearance and the particular skill set that comes from years of keeping people alive in situations designed to kill them. The 30 seconds end. Her hand releases the flag. She stands, straightens her scrubs, and checks her reflection in the supply closet mirror. The nurse looking back is unremarkable. Competent. Deferential. Nobody important. That's the mask that works. That's the cover that holds. That's the woman who can walk through these corridors unnoticed and see everything. At 2:00 hours, Sarah makes her routine check of room 347 despite technically being assigned to a different ward on the ICU rotation. Her Pentagon mission briefing requires daily kernel monitoring regardless of official assignment restrictions. She moves through the darkened corridor like someone familiar with moving through darkness, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the tile. The monitors hum their continuous rhythm, the sound like mechanical breathing, like the life support systems have learned to breathe in unison with the patients. She approaches the colonel's bedside and something in her combat-trained nervous system snaps immediately to attention. His left pupil is blown, dilated to maximum, unresponsive to the penlight she pulls from her pocket. His breathing pattern has shifted into Cheney-Stokes respiration, the characteristic pause and surge pattern that means neurological deterioration is accelerating. She's seen this pattern before in Baghdad, in the field hospital tent where she performed thoracotomies on Marines whose lungs were filling with blood, where she learned to read the body's failure modes like a book written in vital signs and blood chemistry. Her combat medic training recognizes the sign immediately, developing brain bleed, probably from the original spinal injury, expanding now into the cerebral space, minutes from herniation. Minutes from the point where intervention becomes impossible. She hits the code button and her pulse doesn't accelerate. Her hands don't tremble. The part of her that is Captain Sarah Chen, trained through 12 years of military medicine in environments designed to kill her, simply steps into the crisis and begins running the calculations. When the overnight resident arrives, Dr. Hassan, a first-year whose anxiety is written across his face in the particular language of young physicians still learning that medicine is about difficult choices, he reviews Mercer's standing orders and shakes his head with the defeated certainty of someone whose career is already being measured against more powerful forces. Dr. Mercer has him on comfort measures with minimal intervention, Hassan says, and there's an apology in his voice. No CT scans after 2200 hours per his protocol. Sarah's investigation briefing materials flash through her mind like tactical data. 3 similar patients died on Mercer's service after mysterious deterioration during night shifts when monitoring was reduced for patient comfort. 3 deaths. All documented. All on her list. All with the same pattern, careful charting, reduced interventions, sudden decompensation that technically occurred during the comfort care period when aggressive measures were contraindicated. She pulls Hassan aside, lowers her voice to the conversational tone of someone simply offering clinical advice. He needs an emergency CT and neurosurgery now, or he's dead in 20 minutes. The resident's face goes pale. He checks his phone nervously, a gesture she recognizes as the tell of someone weighing institutional politics against patient safety. Mercer will destroy me if I override his protocol. He's the department vice chair. He sits on my evaluations. Sarah nods because she understands the calculation. She's made it herself 1,000 times, the moment where you choose between your career and your conscience. Then leave, she tells him, and her voice is gentle in the way voices are gentle when they're asking someone to walk away from their own ship. I'll take responsibility. Hassan hesitates, then walks away. Sarah knows what she's about to do violates every regulation keeping her hidden in this hospital, every protocol that separates a nurse from a doctor, every boundary of her cover identity. The Pentagon sent her here to observe and document, not to intervene. She's supposed to be the invisible woman collecting data for an investigation, not the person who saves the patient and blows the operation. But the colonel begins posturing, his back arching into the rigid extension that means brainstem involvement, that means herniation is occurring in real time, and Sarah makes the choice that will change everything. She pages the OR to prepare for emergency burr-hole procedure. Her hands move on their own toward the supply cabinet with the muscle memory of someone who learned field medicine when field meant a tent with incoming fire and limited supplies and patients who would die if you hesitated for even 30 seconds. She has minutes. The Pentagon sent her to observe. But she's watched one person die under Mercer's command already, and she won't watch another. Not while she has breath in her body. Not while her hands still function. Not while the choice between her mission and her conscience is still something she can make. The alarm sounded at 0200 hours. A single note, sharp and insistent, cutting through the ICU's artificial quiet like a blade through silk. Sarah's hands froze mid-documentation at the nursing station 3 floors below where she wasn't supposed to be. Room 347. The colonel's room. The ward she'd been reassigned away from just hours ago, as punishment for questioning protocols, for documenting what Mercer had done. She didn't hesitate. She moved. The stairwell was empty, fluorescent lit and institutional grey. Her shoes, the same combat boots she'd bought at a surplus store in Annapolis 30 years ago, soles worn to a particular shape only by someone who'd walked through Helmand Province dust, made no sound on the tile. Muscle memory took over. The kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from nursing school. Room 347 was chaos in motion. The colonel's body rigid, arched in a seizure that meant only one thing. His eyes rolled back. His jaw clenched so tight the ventilator tube could tear through tissue. The nurse on duty, a second-year RN named Marcus who'd been avoiding Sarah since Mercer's threat, was frozen beside the bed, and hovering uselessly near the fall line. "Call neurology," Sarah said. Quiet. No inflection. Just command. Marcus jumped. "You're not assigned to this." Sarah was already moving past him, already checking the pupils, already noting the one sign that made her blood run cold. The left pupil was blown. Dilated. Non-responsive. That wasn't a seizure. That was a brain herniating. That was the colonel dying, right now, in real time, because Mercer had ordered the neurocheck scaled back. Less monitoring. Less documentation. Less evidence of deterioration. This was it. This was the moment the Pentagon investigation needed. Proof. Mercer letting a patient decompensate to inflate his research mortality data, to show that his new protocol, the one that cut staffing and monitoring, somehow had better outcomes than the old one. The math only worked if patients died quietly, without interference. Without someone like Sarah noticing. She locked the door behind her. Not a request. A statement of fact. Marcus was already reaching for his phone, but Sarah's hand caught his wrist, not hard, just enough to pause him. "You need plausible deniability," she said. For words. All he needed to understand that what happened next couldn't have witnesses. That if this went wrong, if anyone could prove he stood there and watched her do it, his career was over. He left. Sarah pulled the crash cart closer with one hand while her other hand was already calculating angles, trajectories, intracranial pressure patterns the way she used to calculate muzzle velocity and wind drift. The colonel's seizure was easing slightly, but his breathing was becoming more labored, his oxygen saturation dropping, 94. 89, 84. The numbers falling like a countdown to something terrible. She moved to the surgical supply cabinet, a place she'd inventoried twice already during her first weeks at Seattle General. Routine nurse thing. Due diligence. Documentation. But really, she'd been mapping exits and resources the way she'd mapped every space she'd occupied since Baghdad. The orthopedic drill was there, a cordless striker with a 4.5mm burr attachment. Built for cranial access. Built for this. Her hands moved with a steadiness that came from somewhere older than her RN license. Somewhere older than her cover identity. Somewhere from a time when she'd done field surgery in the back of a Humvee with ammunition boxes as a table and a combat knife as her primary instrument while rounds pinged off armor plating and someone screamed that Rodriguez was bleeding out and could she fix him, could she? She could fix this. Prep. Her fingers worked through the steps with automatic precision, skin antisepsis with betadine, her touch light and efficient, sterile field. She'd already pulled gloves and drapes, landmarks. She identified the temporal region, the thin spot in the skull that would give her access. Pain was information. Her hands didn't tremble when there was work to do. The drill hummed to life, a sound like a dentist's tool but deeper, more insistent. She positioned it at the landmark, the junction between the temporal and parietal bones, and pressed gently. The bone resisted, then gave way. The burr bite into skull with a pressure release sensation, like popping a bottle cap. Dark blood welled up. That was the epidural hematoma, the blood pressing against the brain, the thing that was killing him. The colonel's body went limp. The posturing stopped. His muscles released their terrible tension. Sarah's breathing didn't change. Her hands didn't shake. The O2 saturation climbed, 86. 89, 92. Back toward something survivable. She irrigated the site with normal saline, her movements carrying the efficiency of someone who'd learned emergency medicine in a place where they didn't have time for hesitation or second thoughts. She placed a temporary drain, a small catheter to keep the blood from reaccumulating, and documented everything with clinical precision. The measurements. The landmarks. The findings. Everything by the book, except for the book that said a nurse couldn't do this. But that wasn't the worst part. At 0245, Dr. Patel arrived. The neurosurgery resident, called in from home, eyes still half closed with sleep until she saw room 347. Saw what had been done. Saw the precision of it. Her gaze traveled from the burr hole to the temporary drain to the colonel's stabilizing vitals to Sarah's face, which remained absolutely expressionless, the face of someone who'd learned that any emotion could be weaponized against you. Who did this? Dr. Patel whispered. Not angry. Shocked. The question of someone staring at competence that made no sense. Patient was herniating. Sarah's voice had dropped 2 octaves. Command voice. The voice she'd used to lead 14 soldiers through a village in Anbar province where the intel was wrong. There wasn't time for protocol. Dr. Patel didn't argue. She took one more look at the colonel's pupils, reactive now, both of them, at his stable rhythm, at the textbook burr hole placement, and she called for transport to the OR. Good work, she said quietly, which meant everything, because it meant she understood what this had cost. Sarah cleaned the room methodically. Disposed of the needle. The gloves. The packaging. Evidence removal that looked exactly like post-emergency cleanup. Her hands worked with the precision of someone who'd once buried a medical kit in the walls of a safe house so it could be retrieved later, if needed. If someone made it back. By 0600, Dr. Mercer arrived at Seattle General with a look on his face like someone who'd spent the night building a case and finally had the evidence he needed to burn her. Someone had shown him the overnight surgical report. The procedure notes. The burr hole documentation. He didn't confront her directly. He was too strategic for that. Instead, he locked himself in his office for 4 hours and built something elaborate. 17 pages of it. Incident reports on forms that cross-referenced each other like a web. Hospital Bylaw 7.3.2 regarding scope of practice violations. State Nursing Practice Act section citing unauthorized practice of medicine. Joint Commission standards she'd allegedly breached. Each violation a thread, woven together with bureaucratic precision into something that looked, on paper, absolutely airtight. He was good at this. He'd been doing it for 30 years. Then came the security footage. He'd pulled the digital files himself, which meant he could edit them. He removed the 60 seconds showing the colonel's pupils blown wide, his posturing, the vital signs escalating into crisis. What remained was narrative, a nurse performing a procedure she had no credential to perform. Practicing medicine without a license. Using equipment without authorization. Violating chain of command. He didn't need to prove malice. He just needed to prove she'd done it. Everything else followed automatically. By 1100 hours, the paperwork was complete. Sarah was called to the HR office. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. She was told her employment was terminated effective immediately. She was told security would escort her from the building. She was told not to attempt to access patient records or contact staff. She was told that risk management would be reviewing whether to recommend prosecution to the state nursing board. She didn't blink. She didn't argue. She simply gathered her badge and her scrubs and walked out with the same composure she'd worn for 42 years, the same composure she'd learned in places Mercer would never have to go. But as she pressed the folded flag, the one from her son's funeral, the one she kept in her locker door pressed against the metal, her jaw tightened. Imperceptibly. A single moment where the mask cracked. Just enough to know that saving the colonel had cost her everything. The mission was blown. Her cover was destroyed. And somewhere in this hospital, Dr. Mercer was sleeping the comfortable sleep of a man who believed he'd won. What he didn't know was that the colonel had survived. What he didn't know was that a Pentagon investigation had just gotten its most important piece of evidence. What he didn't know was that calling in federal investigators was like calling in an airstrike on your own position. It didn't matter how well you'd covered your tracks. Because some people didn't need a uniform to be dangerous. Some people just needed a reason. By morning, Dr. Mercer had transformed Sarah's heroism into a paper trail of violations. 17 pages. That's how many sheets he'd compiled before dawn, each one a carefully constructed lie formatted with the precision of someone who'd spent decades weaponizing bureaucracy. Practicing medicine without a license. Performing unauthorized surgery. Violating chain of command. Unauthorized use of surgical equipment. Each charge was cross-referenced to hospital bylaws, each bylaw linked to Joint Commission standards she'd allegedly breached. The documentation sat on the risk management director's desk like a prosecutor's case file, and Mercer had signed every page with the confidence of a man who understood that in hospitals, paperwork was a weapon more effective than any blade. By 0800 hours, he'd added testimony. He described her pattern of overstepping with the clinical tone of a pathologist documenting tissue decay. He'd noted the clear danger to patient safety she represented. He'd emphasized the hospital's liability exposure. He'd been meticulous. He'd been thorough. He'd been wrong in every way that mattered, and completely unassailable in every way that counted. The security footage he'd submitted to risk management told a story that bore no resemblance to what had actually happened. It showed Sarah performing a procedure with surgical equipment in an ICU room. It showed her working over the colonel's unconscious form. But it was missing 60 seconds, the crucial minute where the colonel's eyes had rolled back, where his body had begun to seize, where death had been walking through the room like something with a name and a schedule. Mercer had edited out the clinical emergency that preceded her intervention. He'd trimmed away the colonel's distress signals. He'd removed the proof that his own negligence had created the crisis Sarah had solved. What remained was footage of a nurse committing a felony, and nothing else. A career-ending liability wearing scrubs. Sarah didn't fight it. When 2 security guards arrived at 0930 with the director of risk management, she was restocking the 4 stations with the same methodical efficiency she'd brought to every task for 3 months. The director's voice was apologetic. He was a decent man, and decent men always sounded apologetic when they were following orders that turned them into instruments. "Ms. Chen, please surrender your badge and accompany us." The charge nurse watched from behind the medication cart. 2 other nurses pretended to be very focused on their charting. A resident found something fascinating to study on the ceiling. Sarah removed her hospital ID with hands that could have been carved from marble. The laminated badge with her photograph and fake credentials, RN, Seattle General, employee number 47823, came off the lanyard and into the director's palm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was a kind of language, the grammar of someone who'd learned long ago that words were only necessary if you were trying to convince someone who could be convinced. The administrative office was windowless and fluorescent bright. Mercer was already seated when they arrived, his documentation spread across the conference table like evidence at trial. He wore the expression of a man convinced of his own righteousness, that particular glaze that coats the eyes of people who've successfully rationalized their own cruelty into policy compliance. The risk management director read from his report. Each charge was recited with the administrative monotone of someone reading from a script that had already been legally vetted. Practicing medicine without a license. Performing surgery without clinical privileges. Violating chain of command. Unauthorized use of surgical equipment from the orthopedic department. Falsifying documentation by omitting the procedure from her initial charting. Mercer added his commentary in measured tones that carried the weight of professional authority. Ms. Chen's pattern of overstepping has been documented for months. This incident represents a clear danger to patient safety and hospital liability. The hospital's legal position is sound, but our primary concern remains the safety of our patients. Lie. 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 But lies told with enough conviction and paperwork became indistinguishable from truth in the systems that governed institutions like this one. Sarah said nothing. Her hands were folded. Her jaw was set. The only movement in her face was the slight twitch of a single muscle beneath her left eye, not distress, just fatigue. The quiet restlessness that comes from holding yourself still when every instinct demands violent action. "You were terminated effective immediately," the director said. It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed up in bureaucratic language. "Security will escort you from the building. You're barred from all patient care areas, effective now. Your access badge is cancelled." Within the hour, Sarah stood in the administrative office parking lot holding a manila envelope containing her personal effects, the folded flag from her son, pressed and creased with the precision of military standards, a photograph of him in his dress uniform, a citation she'd never worn because wearing it would have compromised her mission. A security guard watched from 10 feet away, his presence both professional and kind, which somehow made it worse. Other nurses watched from the building's glass doors. Dr. Rashid caught her eye for a moment, then looked away. Not from fear, exactly. From uncertainty. From the knowledge that association with Sarah had become contagious, and in hospitals, as in most hierarchies, contamination spread faster than antibiotics could contain it. That evening, Sarah stood alone in the hospital laundry room. The industrial dryers were still running, a rhythmic tumble that sounded like distant artillery. She pulled her navy scrubs from the warm bin, each piece still holding the heat from the cycle, the institutional detergent heavy in the air. The fabric smelled of bleach and surrender. She began to fold. Not the way civilians folded, haphazard, practical, moving with the efficiency of someone who simply wanted the task completed. She folded the way she'd been taught at Annapolis 20 years ago, the way her hands remembered from 2 decades of military life. The corners came together with surgical precision. The sleeves aligned. The pants were creased as if they'd been rolled for deployment. Each fold was a small ceremony, a ritual movement that transformed cloth into geometry, chaos into order. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. No one was watching. No one was here to see her fail, which somehow made it worse. She'd taken an oath to complete her mission. She'd been assigned to document Dr. Mercer's negligence, to gather evidence that would justify a Pentagon investigation, to ensure that no more wounded veterans died because of one man's willingness to falsify treatment outcomes for research data. She'd succeeded. And it had destroyed her cover. The colonel was alive. That part had worked. Her field thoracotomy with a combat knife borrowed from orthopedic supplies had bought him 2 more days. He would recover. His neural pathways would begin the slow process of reorganization. He would live to ask questions about how a broken paralyzed man had suddenly stabilized under the care of a nurse who'd performed a surgical procedure she wasn't supposed to know how to perform. But her mission, the Pentagon investigation, the exposure of Mercer's conspiracy, the documentation of his falsified outcomes, that had evaporated the moment she'd chosen saving a life over maintaining her false identity. She placed the folded scrubs on the return cart. 12 pieces. 12 perfect folds. 12 small ceremonies of surrender. The cart would go to the laundry service tomorrow. Her scrubs would be washed with the others, mixed back into the industrial cycle of hospital life, indistinguishable from every other nurse's uniform. In a week, they'd be assigned to someone else. In a month, no one would remember they'd ever belonged to Sarah Chen. Her phone buzzed. A single text from a number that was never supposed to be used outside emergencies, cover blown. Mission compromised. New orders coming. She didn't respond. She just walked toward the exit, the manila envelope holding her son's folded flag pressed against her chest like a wound that had never quite healed. The security guard at the loading dock nodded as she passed. Professional. Kind. Final. Outside, Atlanta's summer air hit her like a closed fist. Humid. Heavy. The sky was beginning to bruise with late afternoon storm clouds. Rain was coming, the kind that fell in sheets on nights like this, the kind that sounded like applause on glass. She'd failed her son. She'd failed her mission. She'd saved a man's life and lost everything for it. She walked toward the parking lot, her shadow stretching long behind her in the failing light, and didn't hear the sound of boots approaching from the hospital entrance, multiple footsteps in perfect formation, the kind of synchronized precision that only came from military training. She didn't hear the Black Hawk helicopter that was being prepped on the hospital roof for immediate departure. She didn't know that a 3-star general was 3 minutes away from standing in the ICU with her citation in his hands and an apology on his lips. 2 days after they escorted her out, Sarah Chen walked back through the employee entrance of Seattle General as if she belonged there, her civilian clothes fitting her like borrowed skin. She wasn't supposed to return, the termination letter had been explicit about that, the language precise and suffocating, but nobody stopped her in the hallway. Security had faces that changed shifts. Memories were short. She took the long route to the administrative office where her personal locker waited, the path that curved past the ICU instead of cutting straight through the main corridor. She wasn't planning to stop. She wasn't planning to look. The ICU doors opened anyway, muscle memory moving her forward before her mind caught up. The ventilator's wheeze was still the same. The monitors still beeped in their chaotic symphony. The overhead lights still hummed like they were holding a secret. Room 347 was 3 doors down, the one where a man's eyes had been empty for 6 weeks, flat as a television screen turned off, no signal coming through. She could see into it from the hallway, just enough to make out the silhouette of his head on the pillow, the rise and fall of mechanical breathing, the green line of the cardiac monitor marching across its screen like an endless funeral procession. She shouldn't look. Looking was unprofessional. Looking was the opposite of every protocol she'd learned in 100 briefings from a dozen Pentagon handlers. Maintaining distance. Preserving cover. Not allowing emotion to leak into the mission, even when the mission had already cost her everything. She looked anyway. The colonel's eyes opened. Not slowly. Not with the gradual flutter of someone waking from sleep. They snapped open like something had flipped a switch inside him, dark and focused, and locked directly onto her face from across the room. For someone who hadn't moved in 6 weeks, hadn't shown voluntary neurological response to anything except painful stimuli, the movement was impossible. Miraculous. It was the kind of thing that made nurses whisper about faith and doctors dismiss as reflexive muscle response. His paralyzed lips moved. The tracheostomy prevented speech, the tube running through his throat making words impossible, but his mouth formed shapes anyway. She could read them from the doorway, the letter-by-letter construction of a single word. V-A-Z-L-K-Y-E-R-I-E in Valkyrie. The call sign only 7 people in the world knew. The call sign for a soldier who didn't exist anymore, who'd been filed away underclassified and dead for 8 years, who'd been resurrected by a Pentagon investigation and buried again under a hospital uniform and a fake employment history. The colonel's eyes didn't blink. Didn't waver. Just locked onto her with the kind of certainty that only came from a soldier recognizing another soldier, the way a radar lock sounds different from everything else because it means someone has found you. Sarah's jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't shake. She stood in the doorway in her civilian clothes and let herself be seen, and that was when the hallway behind her filled with footsteps. The Marine colonel from Walter Reed arrived first, his uniform pressed so sharply you could cut something on the creases, his gait the smooth efficiency of someone who'd spent 32 years moving through danger zones. Behind him came 3 more officers in dress uniform, the kind of group that made administrative staff turn away from their computers, and then came the 3-star general, his chest heavy with medals the color of old blood, his eyes carrying the weight of decisions that had cost people their lives. The Pentagon liaison moved alongside him, tablet in hand, the civilian translator between worlds that didn't speak the same language anymore. They stopped in the hallway. All of them. Looking at her. Captain Sarah Chen, the Marine colonel said, his voice carrying the acoustics of a command that had never learned to whisper. His words traveled down the hallway like a radio broadcast, gathering witnesses. Nurses emerged from patient rooms. Residents paused mid-conversation. The administrative staff that had processed her termination 2 days ago suddenly looked up from their desks. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Baghdad, while serving as a medical operative with the 75th Ranger Regiment, you are hereby cited for. The 3-star general stepped forward before the citation finished, moved through the gathering crowd with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He was tall the way mountains were tall, not just height but mass, authority, the physical embodiment of 42 years of command. His hand came up, and the entire hallway went still. Not because he made a sound. Because he didn't. His silence was louder than any voice could be. He saluted her. The movement was slow, deliberate, a soldier's acknowledgement of another soldier's service. His right hand came up palm forward, held against his right temple, the motion carrying 8 years of classified missions and 2 combat tours and a son buried in Arlington Cemetery with a flag folded tight as a prayer. Behind him, the Marine colonel saluted. The liaison officer saluted. The gathered nurses and residents and administrative staff seemed to inhale together, and Sarah watched them do the mathematics in their heads. The same quiet woman they'd been told was incompetent, was overstepping, was pushing beyond her scope, was causing problems for Dr. Mercer, was nothing. Was a salute from a 3-star general. The general's hand moved to her uniform, to the space where Sarah's civilian blouse had no medals, no insignia, no evidence of anything except a woman who'd spent the last 3 months pushing a supply cart and collecting abuse from a man whose greatest fear was competence he didn't control. From his dress uniform pocket, he produced a medal on a ribbon, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, the kind that came with classified service records and ceremony done in rooms with no windows. He pinned it to her chest with hands that had given orders to send soldiers into hell. The ribbon was silk the color of old gold, and it caught the fluorescent light like a tiny sunrise. "Your service is recognized," the general said, his voice the sound of authority at rest. Not loud. Just inevitable. "Your sacrifice is honored." That was when Dr. Mercer appeared. He pushed through the crowd with the desperation of a man watching his world collapse, his face reddening like the skin was filling with blood too fast, like pressure was building beneath the surface and beginning to crack the carefully maintained professional facade. His voice came out raw. "This is highly irregular. I have documentation. I filed proper termination procedures." The 2 FBI agents moved simultaneously, their appearance so perfectly timed it seemed choreographed, men in dark suits with the kind of posture that came from carrying loaded weapons under their jackets. They moved to either side of Mercer with the gentle precision of people who'd been trained to restrain without drawing attention. One of them held a folder, manila and thick, the kind that contained evidence of a life's work being dismantled one document at a time. At 0317 hours 2 days ago, someone using your credentials accessed Sarah Chen's personnel files and attempted to alter her educational background, the first agent said, his voice flat as a machine reading data. "You added fabricated complaints from previous employers in her record at Johns Hopkins, at Bethesda Naval Hospital, at 6 other facilities. I was ensuring documentation accuracy." "You triggered federal database alerts," the second agent interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of an investigation that had been running in the background since Sarah had performed that burr hole procedure with a combat knife and a surgeon's precision. "Captain Chen's records are flagged for active investigation. Your access attempt pinged 3 different agencies, FBI, Defense Criminal Investigative Service, and the Office of Inspector General, which made them very interested in examining all your documentation practices." They opened the folder. The papers inside caught the hallway light, printouts of server logs, screenshots of altered files, highlighted sections where someone had methodically falsified records. 18 months of documentation. Lab values changed post hoc. Medication administration times adjusted. Nursing observations deleted entirely, as if certain patients had never improved at all, as if their progress had never happened, as if the only truth was the one Dr. Mercer had documented. "Your patient list shows a pattern," the liaison officer said, stepping forward with the voice of someone who'd spent 6 months building this case, stacking the evidence like bricks. "Special Forces veterans under your care show sudden deteriorations during periods when you'd ordered monitoring reductions. 3 of them died. 3 men who had improving neurological exams documented by nursing staff, who were on trajectory for recovery until you implemented your experimental protocols." She produced a tablet showing the faces of 3 soldiers. Young. Burned. Broken. Dead. Captain Chen's intervention with the colonel would have made him the 4th. Mercer's hands were trembling now, not with rage but with the trembling that came from a man watching everything constructed through career, every publication, every grant, every promotion purchased with falsified data, being exposed as fraud. His mouth opened and closed without words. The hospital CEO was standing behind the agents now, his face ashen, his role shifting from administrative guardian to witness to a man's professional destruction. "You're suspended pending investigation," the CEO said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "Effective immediately." Security arrived, the same officers who'd escorted Sarah out 2 days ago, their body language now directed at a different target. They moved to either side of Mercer with the practiced gentleness of people trained to restrain without creating a scene, but the scene was already happening. The hallway had gone dead silent except for the sound of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like they were feeding on this moment. The FBI agent produced handcuffs. Not with drama. Not with ceremony. With the bureaucratic efficiency of someone processing a piece of evidence. Federal charges include falsifying medical records affecting VA contract payments, which constitutes fraud against the United States government. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. They read him his rights in a hallway full of nurses and residents and administrative staff who'd watched him humiliate Sarah, who'd laughed at his grand rounds mockery, who'd averted their eyes when he made his threats. His hands were cuffed behind his back now, the metal clicking home with a sound like a cell door closing, like a future being locked away. They walked him toward the elevator, past the ICU where his victims had deteriorated on his orders, past the nursing station where he destroyed Sarah's employment with 17 pages of fabricated documentation, past colleagues who suddenly found their shoes very interesting. His face was pale. Sweating. The trembling had spread from his hands to his shoulders, the kind of trembling that came from fear he'd never shown his victims, fear he'd hidden beneath credentials and authority, and the kind of institutional armor that only cracked when someone with more authority decided to pull it off. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside. They closed on his face, and the hallway seemed to exhale. The general turned to Sarah, his presence like gravity itself had solidified. The colonel's survival gave us enough evidence to prosecute the entire conspiracy, he said quietly, so quietly that only Sarah could hear it. 18 months of falsified records. 3 federal agencies now involved. What you did, not just saving his life, but refusing to compromise your mission to do it, that broke open the entire operation. 6 months later, Sarah sat in a chair before the Senate Armed Services Committee wearing her Navy dress uniform, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal pinned to her chest where it belonged. Behind her, blown up on screens 20 feet tall, were the faces of 3 soldiers who died under Dr. Mercer's care. Their names. Their ranks. Their service records. The colonel sat in a wheelchair to her right, his hand steady on the armrests, his voice steady in his throat, speaking about the nurse who'd refused to give up when everyone else had written him off as a Mercer care admission. Sarah's testimony led to 17 criminal indictments. Her voice, steady and precise and carrying the weight of 8 years of classified operations, detailed the pattern she'd recognized in 72 hours of observation. Lab values that didn't correlate with patient status. Monitoring protocols reduced in inverse proportion to clinical improvement. Comfort care only orders written for men whose prognosis was improving, whose families had been told the fight was over when the fight had barely begun. When it was over, when the senators had finished their questions and the cameras had stopped recording, Sarah walked out of that hearing room into morning light, her son's folded flag now mounted in her Pentagon office where it caught the sunrise every day. She'd been assigned to the Defense Health Agency's Investigative Oversight Division, directing a team that examined treatment failures across 12 VA contract facilities. Her assistant had forwarded a news article that morning, a curiosity more than anything. Dr. Mercer was listed as a CPR instructor at a community college outside Atlanta, teaching high school students basic life support for $15.87 per hour, his medical license revoked, his career burned down to its foundation, 8 months of federal prison behind him and a lifetime of questions ahead. Sarah deleted the email without reading past the first line. She had testimony to prepare. Investigations to oversee. Lives to save. That was the work. That was the only thing that mattered now. Her son's photograph sat on her desk beside her keyboard, his smile frozen at 23, his eyes carrying the certainty of someone who'd trusted her to finish what they'd started. She couldn't bring him back. But she could make sure no other family had to fold a flag instead of bringing their soldier home. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe for more untold stories of unrecognized heroism. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value. We'll see you next time.